Sometimes the heaviest burdens we carry aren't the ones we choose, but the ones we inherit from our own broken choices. For mountain man Eli Boone, 15 years of solitude in the Montana wilderness had been his penance for losing the only thing that ever mattered, his son. Living alone in his weathered cabin, Eli thought he'd found peace among the pines. Then a wild German shepherd appeared, watching him from the trees. The dog wouldn't leave, following Eli day after day, like it knew something he didn't. At first, Eli figured it was just a lost pet, but this dog had purpose in its eyes, and persistence that wouldn't quit. When the dog finally led him to an old wagon hidden in the forest, Eli discovered something that would shatter his world all over again. What was buried in that wreckage that made a grown man fall to his knees and weep? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eli Boone hadn't always been a man who talked to the wind. There was a time when his voice filled ranger stations across Montana, when his laugh echoed through family dinners, and when bedtime stories were his specialty. That man seemed like a stranger now, someone he'd known in another life before the world taught him that love and loss were two sides of the same cruel coin. The weathered photograph in his jacket pocket told the story of who he used to be. In it, a younger Eli stood beside a grinning 12-year-old boy with gap teeth and untamed hair, Jacob. Even now, 15 years later, Eli's fingers would find that photo during his loneliest moments, tracing the edges worn soft from handling. The boy in the picture wore a red flannel shirt and held a fishing pole like it was a treasure. The man beside him wore a Forest Service uniform and an expression of pure contentment. Both versions of themselves were gone now, lost somewhere in the Pine Ridge Mountains on an October morning that changed everything. Eli had been a Forest Service ranger for 18 years before it all fell apart. He knew these mountains like a man knows his own heartbeat, every trail, every seasonal stream, every place where the morning mist gathered in the valleys. He'd guided countless search and rescue operations, brought lost hikers home to their families, and prided himself on never losing anyone under his watch. The irony wasn't lost on him that the one person he couldn't save was his own son. The small cabin where Eli now lived sat in a clearing 12 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by an overgrown trail that he'd deliberately let nature reclaim. He'd built it himself during those first raw months after Jacob's death, when the sound of other people's voices felt like sandpaper on an open wound. The structure was simple, but solid logs he'd cut and fitted himself, a stone chimney that drew clean, and windows that faced east. Toward the sunrise Jacob had always loved. Every morning began the same way. Eli would wake before dawn, build up the fire, and make coffee strong enough to wake the dead. He'd carved a small wooden cross during those early days in the mountains, whittling away his grief, one careful cut at a time. It sat on the mantel now, a reminder of his struggle with both faith and guilt. Some days he prayed to it, other days he cursed it. Most days he simply acknowledged its presence like an old friend who'd seen him at his worst and stayed anyway. His daily routine had become a meditation of sorts. Check the snares he'd set for rabbits, tend the small garden where he grew potatoes, onions, and hardy greens that could survive the mountain weather, chop wood for the fire, mend whatever needed mending, fish the stream that ran clear and cold behind the cabin. These simple tasks had become the scaffolding that held his days together, preventing them from collapsing into the kind of grief that swallows men whole. But routines, no matter how carefully constructed, have a way of being disrupted. The German shepherd first appeared on a Tuesday morning in early October. Eli had been splitting wood behind the cabin when he felt the weight of being watched. He looked up to see the dog standing at the edge of the clearing, maybe 50 yards away. It was a magnificent animal, large and well-muscled, with the classic black and tan markings of its breed. But there was something wild about it, something that spoke of months or maybe years living rough in the wilderness. The dog didn't approach. It simply stood there, watching with an intelligence that made Eli uncomfortable. When he moved, the dog moved. When he stopped, the dog stopped. It was like having a shadow with 4 legs and an agenda he couldn't fathom. "Go on," Eli had called out, waving his axe handle in the air. "Get out of here. I don't have anything for you." The dog tilted its head but didn't budge. Those amber eyes seemed to look right through him, as if the animal could see something Eli couldn't. After 10 minutes of this strange standoff, Eli went back to splitting wood, figuring the dog would get bored and wander off. When he looked up again an hour later, the dog was gone. But it came back the next day, and the day after that. By the end of the first week, Eli had begun to feel like he was living with a ghost. The dog never came close enough to touch, never approached the cabin, never made a sound. It would appear at random moments throughout the day, standing by the stream when Eli went to fish, sitting at the edge of the clearing when he worked in the garden, materializing from behind trees when he walked the trail to check his snares. Always watching, always keeping that same careful distance. Eli tried everything he could think of to discourage the animal. He yelled at it, threw sticks in its direction, and even tried ignoring it completely. Nothing worked. The dog had the patience of stone and the persistence of water wearing down rock. After 2 weeks of this strange dance, Eli found himself looking forward to seeing the animal each morning, though he'd never admit it out loud. "You're wasting your time," he told the dog one morning as he sat on his porch with his coffee. The animal was in its usual spot by the tree line, watching him with those unsettling amber eyes. "I'm not the kind of man who keeps pets anymore. I'm not the kind of man who keeps anything." The dog's ears perked up at the sound of his voice, but it remained where it was. Eli had noticed that it seemed to understand when he was talking to it, even from a distance. Its body language would change, becoming more alert, more focused. Sometimes Eli caught himself having entire conversations with the animal, explaining his daily plans or sharing observations about the weather. It was the most talking he'd done in years. The memories always came strongest in the evenings, when the work was done and there was nothing left to distract him from the ache that never quite went away. Jacob would have been 27 now, probably married, maybe with children of his own. Eli tried not to think about the grandchildren he'd never meet, the birthdays he'd never celebrate, the fishing trips that would never happen. But sitting alone in his cabin with only the fire for company, those thoughts had a way of finding him anyway. Jacob had been everything good in Eli's world. Curious and brave, gentle with animals, quick to laugh, and eager to learn everything his father could teach him about the wilderness. The boy had natural instincts for reading weather and tracking animals that had amazed even Eli, who'd spent his whole life in the mountains. Jacob could spot deer sign that experienced hunters would miss, could predict storms hours before they hit, and could navigate by the stars with a confidence that seemed almost supernatural. "Dad, look," Jacob had said on their last morning together, pointing to tracks in the soft earth beside their campfire.
Well, now you have time that
a mama deer and her baby passed through here during the night. See how the little hoof prints stay real close to the big ones? She's teaching him to be careful. Eli's marriage to Susan hadn't survived Jacob's death. How could it? They'd blamed each other, blamed themselves, and blamed a universe that would take a 12-year-old boy who'd never hurt anyone. Susan had wanted to keep looking long after the official search was called off. She'd organized volunteer groups, put up flyers, and clung to hope long after hope became a cruelty. Eli had wanted to keep looking too, but he'd also been the one who understood these mountains best. He knew what a week alone in October weather meant for a boy with no survival gear. He knew, even if he couldn't bring himself to say it out loud. The drinking started as a way to sleep without dreams. It ended as a way to avoid sleeping at all. Eli lost his job, his marriage, and finally his house. He'd hit bottom so hard that he'd bounced, and when he came to rest, it was here in these mountains where Jacob's spirit still lingered in every sunrise. Now, Watching the German Shepherd maintain its patient vigil at the edge of his world, Eli felt something stirring that he'd thought was long dead. Curiosity. The dog's behavior was unlike anything he'd encountered in his years as a ranger. Wild animals were predictable. They either approached humans looking for food, or they avoided humans entirely. This dog was doing neither. It was patient and purposeful in a way that suggested intelligence beyond simple animal instinct. "What do you want from me?" Eli asked the dog that evening as he sat on his porch. The animal was barely visible in the gathering darkness, just a darker shadow against the trees. "I told you, I don't have anything to give." But even as he said the words, Eli knew they weren't entirely true. He had stories. He had knowledge of these mountains. He had years of accumulated wisdom about survival and wildlife and weather patterns. Most of all, he had time. More time than any man should have to spend alone with his regrets. The dog remained perfectly still, watching him with what almost seemed like patience, as if it was waiting for something. As if it knew something he didn't. That night, for the first time in months, Eli dreamed of Jacob. In the dream, his son was calling his name from somewhere far away. His voice carried on a wind that smelled of pine needles and autumn leaves. When Eli woke, the sun was just breaking over the ridge, painting the sky the color of Jacob's favorite flannel shirt. The German Shepherd was sitting on his porch. It was the closest the animal had ever come to the cabin, and Eli's breath caught in his throat as he looked through his window at the magnificent
How have I been streaming for 2 hours?
In the early morning light, he could see details he'd missed before.
It feels like I've been going
the
for
dog
half
was
an
thinner
hour.
than it had appeared from a distance, but not starved.
Frog, you know how I mentioned that I might do a 12-hour stream today?
As if it had been taking care of itself. Most striking were its eyes, which held an intelligence that seemed almost human. Eli moved slowly to his door, half expecting the dog to bolt at his approach. Instead, it simply watched him, head tilted slightly to one side. When Eli stepped onto the porch, the dog stood but didn't retreat. They regarded each other in the morning stillness, man and animal separated by perhaps 10 feet, and an understanding that neither could quite grasp. "Well," Eli said softly, "this is new." The dog's tail moved just once, a slight wag that might have been acknowledgement. Then, without warning, it turned and trotted toward the tree line. At the edge of the clearing, it stopped and looked back at Eli, as if waiting for something. As if waiting for him to follow. Eli stood on his porch for a long moment, coffee mug growing cold in his hands, watching the German Shepherd wait at the edge of his world. The dog's posture was unmistakable. It wanted him to follow. Every instinct told him to go back inside, to stick to his routine, to avoid whatever complications this animal might bring into his carefully ordered solitude. But something deeper, something that felt like an echo of the man he used to be, made him set down his mug and step off the porch. The dog began moving the moment Eli's boots touched the ground. It didn't run or bound ahead like an excited pet. Instead, it moved with deliberate purpose, checking over its shoulder every few yards to ensure Eli was following. They walked past the stream where Eli fished each morning, past the grove of aspens where he'd built a blind for watching deer, and into territory that even after 15 years in these mountains, he rarely visited. The terrain grew rougher as they climbed. Ancient pines towered overhead, their trunks so massive that 3 men couldn't wrap their arms around them. The forest floor was carpeted with decades of fallen needles, creating a path that muffled their footsteps. Eli's breathing grew labored as they ascended, and he realized how much his hermit lifestyle had affected his conditioning. The dog, meanwhile, moved through the wilderness, like it was
the tiny amount
home.
of glove that I've made so far.
After nearly an hour of hiking, the dog stopped beside a massive boulder that jutted from the mountainside like a broken tooth.
It's progressing,
Eli caught up, his shirt damp with sweat, despite the cool morning air. The dog was staring intently at something beyond the boulder, its body rigid with concentration. When Eli rounded the rock formation, he saw what had captured the animal's attention. Hidden in a small depression behind the boulder lay the remnants of what had once been a wagon. Time and weather had reduced it to scattered boards and rusted metal, but the basic shape was still recognizable. Wild vines had grown through the wreckage, and decades of fallen leaves had nearly buried it completely. If not for the dog's guidance, Eli might have walked past it 100 times without noticing.
So maybe it's just my fingers
but it wasn't the wagon itself that made Eli's knees buckle. It was what lay half buried in the debris, a small brass compass, its metal surface green with age but still intact. Eli knew that compass. He'd given it to Jacob for his 10th birthday, a Boy Scout compass, with the boy's initials engraved on the back. The same compass Jacob had been carrying the day he disappeared. Eli's hands shook as he picked up the instrument, brushing away 15 years of dirt and leaves. Despite its age and exposure, the needle still moved, still pointed steadily north. He turned it over, and there, barely visible but unmistakably real, were the initials JB that he'd had engraved at the hardware store in town. "How is this here?" Eli whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind in the pines. "How did you know?" The German Shepherd was watching him with those intense amber eyes, its head tilted as if it understood the significance of what had just happened. Eli stared at the compass in his palm, his mind racing through possibilities and implications. The search teams had covered this area repeatedly during those desperate weeks after Jacob's disappearance. How had they missed this wagon? How had he missed it during his own subsequent searches? The answer came to him slowly, reluctantly.
I forgot
the wagon sat in what rangers called a dead zone, an area where the terrain played tricks with sound and visibility. The depression was deep enough to hide the wreckage from casual observation, and the surrounding boulders created acoustics that made voices echo strangely. Search teams following standard grid patterns would have walked past this spot dozens of times without seeing what lay hidden.
How's your head doing, by the way?
Eli sank to his knees beside the wagon, the compass clutched in his fist. For 15 years, he'd carried the weight of not knowing what had happened to his son. The lack of closure had been its own special torture, not knowing whether Jacob had suffered, whether he'd been afraid, whether he'd called for his father in those final moments. The compass was the first concrete evidence that Jacob had actually been in this area, that the search hadn't been completely misdirected. But it also meant something else, something that made Eli's chest tight with renewed grief. It meant Jacob had made it much farther from their original campsite than anyone had imagined. The boy had been resourceful, had used his wilderness training, had survived longer than the search teams believed possible. And Eli had called off his personal searches too soon. The memory came flooding back with painful clarity. It had been 3 weeks after the official search was suspended. Eli had been out here alone, calling Jacob's name until his voice gave out, following every game trail and deer path he could find. Susan had been at home, manning the phones in case someone called with information. The first snow of the season had started to fall, and Eli knew that if Jacob was still alive somewhere in these mountains, the weather would kill him within days. He'd made the hardest decision of his life that afternoon. Standing in another clearing not 5 miles from where he knelt now, he decided to go home. He decided that continuing to search was only prolonging everyone's agony. He decided that Jacob was gone. "I'm sorry," Eli whispered to the compass, to the memory of his son, to the dog that had somehow led him here. "I'm sorry I stopped looking. I'm sorry I gave up on you." The German Shepherd moved closer, close enough that Eli could feel the warmth radiating from its body. The animal didn't try to comfort him, it wasn't that kind of gesture, but its presence felt like solidarity, like acknowledgement of shared loss. Eli spent the next hour searching through the wagon debris with his hands, looking for anything else that might tell him about Jacob's final days. He found fragments of old metal that might have been part of a camp stove, pieces of rotted canvas that could have been tent fabric, and what appeared to be the remains of a wooden crate. But it was clear that the wagon had been here for much longer than 15 years. This was some prospectors' or trappers' abandoned equipment from the early days of mountain settlement, probably dating back 50 or 60 years. What mattered was that Jacob had found it. The compass proved that his son had made it this far into the wilderness, probably looking for shelter or supplies. Eli tried to imagine Jacob as he must have been cold, scared, but still thinking, still trying to survive. The boy had always been clever about such things, and finding this wagon would have seemed like a miracle to a lost child. As the sun climbed higher, Eli became aware that the German Shepherd was moving again, exploring the area around the wagon with the same purposeful intensity it had shown in leading him here. The dog would sniff at a particular spot, then look back at Eli as if checking to see whether he was paying attention. When Eli approached the spots the dog was investigating, he found more evidence of human presence, a depression in the ground that might have been a fire pit, stones arranged in a pattern that suggested they'd once supported cooking equipment. Someone had definitely camped here, and recently enough that traces remained visible. Whether it was Jacob or someone else was impossible to determine. But the dog seemed convinced that these signs mattered. Each discovery the animal led him to felt deliberate, as if the dog was trying to tell him a story he was too slow to understand. By midday, exhaustion and emotional overload forced Eli to call a halt to the search. He needed time to process what he'd found, to consider what it meant. The compass alone was enough to rewrite everything he thought he knew about Jacob's disappearance. If his son had made it this far, what else might be possible? What other assumptions about that terrible week needed to be reconsidered? The hike back to the cabin felt like a journey through a different landscape than the one he'd traveled that morning. Every tree, every rock formation, every bend in the trail held new possibilities. Somewhere in these mountains were more answers, more pieces of the puzzle that Jacob's life had become. The German Shepherd had shown him that much. As they reached the clearing where his cabin sat, Eli turned to look at the dog that had changed everything. The animal was watching him with what might have been satisfaction, as if the morning's work was just the beginning of something larger. "Who are you?" Eli asked. "And how did you know where to find that compass?" The dog tilted its head, amber eyes reflecting the afternoon sun. Then it walked to the exact spot where it had maintained its vigil for the past 3 weeks, the edge of the clearing by the tree line. But now, instead of watching Eli, from a distance, it lay down and settled in like it was planning to stay. For the first time in 15 years, Eli Boone wasn't going to spend the night alone. Eli barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Jacob's compass pointing steadily north, its brass surface catching the morning light like a beacon from the past. The discovery had shattered the careful walls he'd built around his grief, and now 15 years of suppressed hope came flooding back with an intensity that left him breathless. He rose before dawn, driven by a restlessness he hadn't felt since those first desperate weeks after Jacob's disappearance. The German Shepherd was still there at the edge of the clearing, lying in the same spot where it had settled the evening before. When Eli stepped onto his porch, the dog's ears perked up, and it rose to its feet with an alertness that suggested it had been waiting for this moment. "All right," Eli said, his voice rough from a sleepless night. "Show to me what else you know." The dog's response was immediate. It turned and headed back toward the trail they'd taken the previous day, moving with the same deliberate purpose, but taking a slightly different route. This time, instead of leading Eli directly to the wagon site, the dog veered west through a stand of lodgepole pines that created natural corridors through the forest. As they walked, Eli found himself studying the animal more carefully than he had before. The dog moved through the wilderness with an economy of motion that spoke of long experience. It avoided loose rocks that might slide underfoot, chose the most efficient paths through dense undergrowth, and seemed to know instinctively where the ground would be most stable. These weren't the movements of a recently lost pet. This was an animal that had been living wild for a substantial amount of time. After an hour of hiking, the dog stopped beside a massive fallen pine that had created a natural bridge across a seasonal creek bed. Eli caught up and immediately saw what had caught the animal's attention. Caught on a broken branch, about 4 feet off the ground, was a small piece of fabric, red and black plaid, faded by weather but still recognizable. Eli's heart hammered against his ribs as he carefully worked the fabric free from the branch. It was wool, sturdy and thick, from what had once been a flannel shirt. Jacob's flannel shirt. The boy had been wearing it the morning they'd started their hiking trip. The same red and black pattern that appeared in dozens of family photographs. "This is impossible," Eli whispered, turning the fabric over in his hands. "The search teams covered this area. I covered this area." But even as he spoke the words, he knew why the evidence had been missed. The fabric was caught high enough on the branch that someone would have to be looking up to spot it. Search teams moved quickly, scanning the ground for footprints or dropped items. A small piece of cloth caught, above eye level, could easily be overlooked, especially in the confusion and desperation of an active search. The dog was already moving again, following the creek bed downstream toward a cluster of granite boulders that formed a natural shelter. Eli followed, clutching the piece of Jacob's shirt like a talisman. Each step felt like walking backward through time, retracing his son's final journey through these mountains. Near the boulders, the dog stopped again and began sniffing at a specific spot on the ground. Eli knelt beside the animal and used his hands to clear away 15 years of accumulated leaves and forest debris. Beneath the organic layer, he found the unmistakable remains of a fire pit stones arranged in a rough circle, with charcoal and ash still visible in the soil at the center. The discovery hit him like a physical blow. Jacob had made a fire here. His 12-year-old son, lost and alone in the wilderness, had remembered the survival lessons his father had taught him. He'd gathered stones, built a fire ring, and managed to create warmth and light in what must have been the most terrifying experience of his young life. Eli's eyes blurred as he imagined the scene. Jacob, probably cold and scared, working by moonlight or the fading light of dusk to build something that would keep him alive through the night. The boy had always been a quick learner when it came to outdoor skills, but applying that knowledge under survival conditions was entirely different. The fact that he'd managed it spoke to a kind of courage that made Eli's chest swell with both pride and devastating sorrow. "Good boy, Jacob," he whispered to the silent forest. "You did exactly what I taught you. You were so brave." The German shepherd watched this emotional display with what seemed like patient understanding. When Eli finally composed himself enough to continue exploring, the dog led him to several other spots around the boulder cluster. Each location revealed more. Evidence of Jacob's presence. A depression in the ground where someone might have slept. Stones that had been moved to create a crude wind barrier. And what appeared to be the remains of a food cache dug into the base of one of the larger rocks. The implications were staggering. Jacob hadn't just wandered lost through the forest for a day or two before succumbing to exposure. He'd survived for an extended period, long enough to establish a semi-permanent camp and develop strategies for staying alive. The boy had been thinking, adapting, fighting for his life with every skill his father had taught him about wilderness survival. As Eli explored each new discovery, he found himself talking to the dog as if the animal could understand every word. The sound of his own voice in the wilderness felt strange after so many years of silence, but somehow natural when directed toward this mysterious companion. "I taught him how to build fires when he was 8, Eli told the dog as they examined the stone circle. "We practiced in the backyard first, then moved to camping trips. He could get a flame going with just matches and dry tinder faster than most adults." The dog's ears perked up at the sound of his voice, and its tail moved in what might have been acknowledgement. There was something about the animal's response that made conversation feel less like talking to himself and more like sharing memories with someone who might actually care about them. "He loved these mountains," Eli continued as they moved to the next site. Said they made him feel like an explorer, like he was the first person to see certain views. "I used to tell him that feeling never goes away, that even when you know a place by heart, it can still surprise you. By late morning, they had thoroughly explored the area around the boulder cluster. The evidence painted a picture of survival that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Jacob had managed to create a functioning wilderness camp using dussateau, nothing but the skills his father had taught him and whatever materials the forest provided. He'd been resourceful, determined, and incredibly brave. But he'd also been 12 years old and completely alone. As they prepared to head back toward the cabin, Eli made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 2 days earlier. He was going to give the dog a name. The animal had earned recognition as more than just a wild creature that had wandered into his life. It deserved acknowledgement as the guide that was helping him piece together the final chapter of his son's story. Scout, Eli said, trying the name out loud. That's what I'm going to call you. Jacob always wanted a dog named Scout. The newly christened Scout tilted his head at the sound of his name, and his tail wagged once in what Eli chose to interpret as approval. For the first time since the dog had appeared in his life, the animal approached close enough that Eli could have reached out and touched him. The gesture lasted only a moment before Scout moved back to his usual careful distance, but it felt like progress. The walk back to the cabin was different from their previous hikes. Now that Scout had a name, now that Eli was talking to him, the relationship between man and dog had shifted into something that felt almost like partnership. They were no longer strangers sharing a trail. They were two beings working together toward a common purpose that was still revealing itself with each new discovery. The next 3 days fell into a pattern that felt both strange and familiar. Each morning, Eli and Scout would set out to explore a different section of the wilderness surrounding the wagon site. Each evening, they would return to the cabin with new pieces of Jacob's story, a discovery that transformed Eli's understanding of his son's final days, while deepening the mystery of how Scout seemed to know exactly where to look. On the 4th day, Scout led him deeper into the forest than they had ventured before, following a game trail that wound between towering Douglas firs toward a ridge Eli had never fully explored. The terrain was challenging, requiring them to scramble over fallen logs and navigate around massive granite outcroppings that jutted from the mountainside like the bones of sleeping giants. As they climbed, Eli found himself breathing hard, but feeling more alive than he had in years. The constant physical activity was awakening muscles and reflexes that had grown dormant during his hermit years. More importantly, the purpose driving each day's exploration was awakening parts of his spirit that he'd thought were permanently buried with Jacob. When they reached a small clearing on the ridge, Scout stopped abruptly and began circling a particular area with intense focus. Eli approached cautiously and immediately understood why the dog was excited. Hidden among a cluster of young aspens was a structure that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a lean-to shelter. Crude but functional, built using techniques that Eli recognized from his own wilderness training. Long branches had been laid against a fallen log to create a slanted roof, then covered with layers of pine boughs and bark to shed rain. Stones had been arranged around the base to hold everything in place, and the entrance faced away from the prevailing wind direction. "My God," Eli whispered, kneeling beside the shelter. "Jacob, you built this." The construction showed clear evidence of the survival skills Eli had spent years teaching his son during their camping trips. The angle of the roof was perfect for shedding water while maximizing interior space. The materials had been chosen with an understanding of what would provide the best insulation and weather protection. Most impressive was the attention to details that many adults would have missed. The entrance was positioned to take advantage of a natural windbreak created by the surrounding trees, and the interior had been lined with dry grasses to create a more comfortable sleeping surface. Scout was already investigating something beyond the shelter, moving with the same purposeful intensity that had led them to each previous discovery. Eli followed, and found what appeared to be a small cave opening, partially hidden behind a curtain of hanging vegetation. The entrance was barely large enough for a person to crawl through, but it opened into a space that was much larger than it appeared from outside. Using the small flashlight he now carried on these expeditions, Eli explored the cave's interior. The space was dry and showed clear signs of human habitation. Someone had arranged flat stones to create a crude floor, and there were obvious places where bedding and supplies had been stored. Near the back wall, protected from moisture and animals, Eli found a cache of items that stopped his heart. Wrapped in what remained of a plastic tarp were several objects that belonged unmistakably to Jacob: a pocket knife that Eli had given him for his 11th birthday, a small metal cup from their camping gear, a waterproof container that still held matches, amazingly dry after all these years.
There's still 2 left
and
on
most
this
heartbreaking
one,
of all, a small wooden whistle that Eli had carved for Jacob when the boy was 7 years old. Eli sat in the cave holding these relics of his son's life, each object a testament to Jacob's determination to survive. The boy had managed to salvage gear from their original campsite and transport it to this remote location. He'd created not just temporary shelter, but a functioning survival camp that could have sustained him for weeks or even months under the right circumstances. The implications were staggering. Jacob hadn't simply gotten lost and died from exposure within a few days. He'd survived long enough to establish multiple camps, to learn the local geography, to develop strategies for finding food and staying warm. The search teams had been looking for a lost child, when they should have been looking for a young survivor who was actively working to stay alive. How long? Eli asked the silent cave walls. How long were you out here fighting to get home to us? Scout appeared at the cave entrance, his silhouette dark against the afternoon light. The dog's presence felt like an anchor to reality in a moment when the weight of discovery threatened to overwhelm Eli's emotional equilibrium. Over the past few days, Scout had become more than a guide. He'd become a companion whose steady presence made it possible to face these revelations about Jacob's final days. Eli carefully rewrapped Jacob's belongings and placed them back in their hiding spot. Something about disturbing the arrangement felt wrong, as if he was violating a sacred space that Jacob had created. The cave felt like a shrine to his son's courage and determination, and it deserved to be left undisturbed. As they made their way back down the ridge toward the sun cabin, Eli found himself talking to Scout about Jacob in ways he'd never been able to talk to Susan or the grief counselors or anyone else who'd tried to help him process his loss. He was always building things, Eli told the dog, as they navigated a particularly tricky section of trail. Forts in the backyard, model airplanes, elaborate contraptions for catching fireflies. His mother used to complain that he treated the garage like his personal workshop. Scout's ears perked up at the mention of Jacob, and he looked back at Eli with those intelligent amber eyes that seemed to understand far more than any dog should. The animal had begun responding to Jacob's name with a kind of focused attention that made Eli wonder if Scout had known his son personally. But that was impossible, wasn't it? The timing didn't work out. Jacob had disappeared 15 years ago, and Scout couldn't be more than 8 or 10 years old. You would have liked him, Eli continued as they reached easier ground. He had a way with animals, always bringing home stray cats and wounded birds, convinced he could nurse anything back to health. Drove his mother crazy, but I admired his optimism. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky the same shade of red as Jacob's flannel shirt. Eli sat on his porch steps while Scout settled into his usual spot at the edge of the clearing. The routine had become comfortable, this evening ritual where they shared the same space while maintaining their respective boundaries. Tomorrow we keep looking, Eli said to the dog. There's more to find out there, isn't there? More pieces of his story. Scout's tail moved once against the ground, not quite a wag, but acknowledgement of some kind. In the gathering darkness, his amber eyes reflected the last light of day, like twin lanterns, marking the way forward into whatever discoveries awaited them in the wilderness that had claimed his son. But somehow, spared enough evidence to keep hope alive after 15 long years of silence. The breakthrough came on a grey morning when low clouds hung over the mountains like a shroud.
Maybe my count
Scout had led Eli to yet another area they hadn't explored, a narrow ravine where a seasonal creek had carved a channel through layers of sedimentary rock. The walls of the ravine created a natural shelter from wind and weather, and Eli could immediately see why someone seeking refuge might be drawn to this hidden valley. At first, there seemed to be nothing unusual about the location. Scout moved through the ravine with his typical purposeful intensity, investigating rocky overhangs and clusters of vegetation with the thoroughness that Eli had come to expect. But when the dog stopped beside a particular boulder and began pawing at something wedged beneath it, Eli's pulse quickened with anticipation. What Scout had found was a cache unlike anything they'd discovered before. Carefully protected beneath the boulder was a collection of thin pieces of birch bark, layered and wrapped to keep them dry. When Eli gently separated the layers, he found that someone had used a sharp instrument to scratch words into the bark's surface, crude lettering that told a story more powerful than any book he'd ever read. It was Jacob's journal. The first entry was dated October 15th, 2 days after Jacob had disappeared from their campsite. Eli's hands trembled as he read his son's careful script, formed with the precision of a boy who'd been taught that neat handwriting was important. Dad will find me soon. I know these mountains pretty good. And I found the old wagon like we saw on that map last summer. There's stuff here I can use. I built a fire and I'm warm enough. The compass still works and points north toward home. I'm not scared because Dad taught me what to do.
What does it read?
Tears blurred Eli's vision as he read those words. Jacob had been alone and lost, but he'd held on to faith that his father would find him. The boy had remembered lessons from previous camping trips, had recalled conversations about old mining and logging operations in these mountains. He'd been thinking clearly, applying his knowledge, and maintaining hope even in circumstances that would have broken most adults. The second entry was dated 3 days later, still no sign of Dad or the rangers. I can hear helicopters sometimes, but they're always too far away. Found a better place to sleep in a cave. There's a dog that comes around sometimes. He's wild but not mean. I shared some jerky with him and now he follows me. I named him Scout, like the dog I always wanted. Eli's breath caught in his throat. Scout.
Yes, go give a follow.
Jacob had named a wild dog Scout, the same name Eli had chosen for the German shepherd that was now sitting beside him, watching with those knowing amber eyes. The coincidence was too perfect to be random, but the implications were impossible to process rationally. He looked at Scout with new understanding. The dog was watching him with an expression that seemed almost expectant, as if waiting for Eli to make connections that had been obvious to the animal all along. But how could this be the same dog? 15 years was longer than most dogs lived, and Scout showed no signs of advanced age. The journal entries continued, documenting Jacob's increasingly sophisticated survival efforts. He'd learned to predict weather patterns by observing cloud formations and wind direction. He'd figured out which plants were safe to eat and where to find clean water. Most remarkably, he'd begun training the wild dog to help him hunt small game and watch for danger. Scout is really smart, Jacob had written. Smarter than any dog I ever met. Sometimes I think he understands when I talk to him. He showed me where there's rabbits and where the water doesn't freeze even when it's cold. I think he likes having someone to take care of. Maybe he was lonely too. As Eli read deeper into the journal, the BIM entries revealed a relationship between boy and dog that had sustained Jacob through weeks of isolation. Scout had become not just a companion but a partner in survival, helping Jacob navigate the wilderness with an intelligence that seemed almost supernatural. Dad always said that dogs choose their people, not the other way around.
21,
Jacob had written in an entry dated
27,
nearly a month after his disappearance. I think Scout chose me because he knew I needed help.
37
But
again.
sometimes I think maybe I chose him too. Maybe we both needed someone to not be alone
fits in my
with.
hand, right?
The journal revealed details about Jacob's survival that amazed Eli with
Yes.
their sophistication. The
And it
boy had
feels
created multiple camps in different
how the other one
locations,
felt.
moving between them based
same
on
point.
weather and available
So I
resources.
think
He'd
my
learned to
numbers
smoke
that I've
meat to
got written
preserve
down
it,
were just wrong.
to predict storms days in advance,
Try and send it, just
and to
trying to figure it
navigate
out.
by
That's all good.
stars when clouds obscured familiar landmarks.
If you can't
Most
figure out, then don't worry
importantly,
too much about
he'd
it.
never stopped believing that someone would eventually find him. But as
So this
Eli
is
read
fitting
the
on my
later
hand,
entries, a
which
different
is the
tone
important
began
part.
to emerge.
So maybe
Jacob's
the 2 extra
handwriting
stitches
remained neat, but the content revealed a
actually
boy
exist.
who was beginning to understand
Me trying to figure
that
out how to
rescue
count. Yeah,
might not
apparently
come
I
as
can't get
quickly as
past
he'd hoped.
37.
The entries became more philosophical, filled with
That's where I
observations
struggle.
about the mountains
30,
and
35,
reflections
36,
on lessons his
37,
father had
nah.
taught him.
I'm
I
trying to
understand
find
now
39 and I
why
can't.
Dad loves it up here, Jacob had written. Everything is honest in the mountains. The weather doesn't lie about what it's going to do if you know how to read the signs. Animals don't pretend to be
We do
something
have a
they're
Discord.
not.
Yes, we do.
Even when things are scary, they're real scary, not fake scary like in movies. Near the end of the journal,
Thank you,
Jacob's
Grace.
entries focused increasingly on Scout and their partnership. The boy had clearly formed a deep bond with the animal, describing their daily routines and the way Scout seemed to anticipate his needs.
Such a weird number. It is.
In one particularly moving
agree.
passage, Jacob had written about teaching Scout simple commands and being amazed at how quickly the dog learned. Scout is the best friend I ever had.
I just hope I have the
Better
right
than any
number
of the kids at school. He never
things
gets
that I need.
tired of my stories, and he never makes fun of me when I get scared at night.
Or was it
Sometimes I
something
think he's
else
not
later?
really just a regular
I have
dog.
no idea.
Sometimes I think maybe he's some kind of guardian angel, except with fur and 4 legs. The final
do that
entry
there?
was
That's not
dated
right.
November 20th, more than a month after Jacob's
The way that
disappearance.
all unfolds
By
like that
then,
is very
the first
satisfying.
heavy snows would have been falling in the high country, making survival exponentially more difficult. Jacob's last words were both heartbreaking and inspiring.
that one.
Getting
There we go.
really cold
That is
now.
correct.
Scout found a good place where we can stay warm together. I want Dad to know I tried my best. I want him to know I remembered everything he taught me. I want him to know I love him and it's not his fault. If something happens to me, I hope Scout finds his way to people who will
I feel like
take
I've
care
listened
of
to
him.
this
He
lo-fi
deserves
song so many
a
times.
good
I
life.
remember it.
He saved mine for as long as he could.
They're meant to change the
Eli
lo-fi
sat in
playlist
the
weekly,
ravine,
but they don't
holding
seem
his
to.
son's final
definitely remember
thoughts,
some of the songs.
tears falling onto the birch bark pages that Jacob had so carefully preserved. The journal painted a picture of survival and courage that filled him with both overwhelming pride and devastating sorrow. Jacob had died not as a lost child, but as a young man who'd fought bravely against impossible odds. And somehow, impossibly, Scout had been there with him through it all. For 3 days after discovering Jacob's journal, Eli couldn't bring himself to venture back into the wilderness. He sat on his porch reading and rereading his son's words, each entry revealing new layers of courage and wisdom that seemed impossible for a 12-year-old boy to possess. The journal had answered some questions while raising others that were even more troubling. Scout maintained his vigil at the edge of the clearing, but his behavior had changed subtly since Eli had read the journal entries that mentioned him by name. The dog seemed more alert, more focused on Eli's emotional state. Several times, Eli caught Scout watching him with an intensity that felt almost protective, as if the animal understood that the discoveries were taking an emotional toll. On the 4th morning, Scout approached the cabin closer than he'd ever come before. He stopped just at the bottom of the porch steps and sat down, looking directly at Eli with those amber eyes that seemed to hold depths of knowledge beyond any normal animal. You were really there with him, weren't you? Eli asked softly.
I look forward to seeing
You're the same Scout, he wrote about. The dog's ears perked up at Jacob's name, and his tail moved once against the ground. It wasn't quite acknowledgement, but it wasn't denial either. For a long moment, man and dog regarded each other in silence, sharing a connection that transcended the usual boundaries between species. Finally, Scout stood and moved toward the tree line, looking back at Eli with the same expectant expression that had started their first expedition together.
I thought it was.
The message was clear. There was more to discover, more pieces of Jacob's story that needed to be found. This time, Scout led Eli in a completely different direction, away from the areas they'd previously explored, and toward a high ridge that offered panoramic views of the surrounding wilderness. The climb was steep and challenging, requiring them to use hands and feet to scramble over rock faces and navigate around cliff edges that dropped away into misty valleys below. As they climbed, Eli found himself thinking about the transformation that had occurred in his life over the past 2 weeks. He'd gone from a hermit who barely spoke to anyone to a man who spent his days hiking through wilderness areas he hadn't visited in years, talking to a dog as if the animal were his closest friend, and feeling more alive than he had since Jacob's disappearance. The ridge Scout led him to was unlike anything Eli had seen in all his years in these mountains. It was a natural promontory that jutted out from the main ridgeline like the prow of a ship, offering 360-degree views of peaks and valleys that stretched to the horizon. But what made the location truly remarkable was what someone had built there. At the highest point of the ridge, carefully constructed from stones that had been carried up from the valley below, was a cairn unlike any natural trail marker Eli had ever encountered. The stones were stacked with precision and artistry, creating a tower nearly 4 feet tall that could be seen from miles away. But it wasn't just the construction that took Eli's breath away, it was what had been carved into the topmost stone. Using a sharp piece of metal or stone, someone had carefully etched 2 sets of initials into the granite surface, J, B, and below that, E, B, Jacob's initials and his own, carved with the same careful precision that had characterized his son's journal entries. Eli sank to his knees beside the cairn, running his fingers over the letters Jacob had cut into solid stone. The carving must have taken hours, probably days, requiring patience and determination that spoke to Jacob's character in ways that no journal entry could capture. His son had built this monument not just as a trail marker, but as a message, a declaration of love that would endure long after he was gone. "He was trying to tell me something," Eli whispered to Scout, who had settled beside him at the base of the cairn. "This whole ridge, you can see everything from here. Every valley where the search teams were looking. He could have seen the helicopters, could have seen the people searching for him." The implications were staggering. Jacob had made it to this ridge, had built this cairn, had been able to observe the search efforts from above, but somehow the searchers had never made it up here. The ridge was difficult to access and not on any established trail system. Unless someone knew exactly where to look, it would be nearly impossible to spot from below. Scout was exploring the area around the cairn with his usual methodical intensity, and soon he led Eli to another discovery that completed the picture Jacob had been trying to create. Hidden among a cluster of boulders near the edge of the ridge was a cache that represented the culmination of Jacob's wilderness survival efforts. Protected from weather and animals by carefully arranged stones was a collection of items that told the story of Jacob's final weeks. There were tools he'd crafted from salvaged materials, fish hooks bent from metal scraps, a crude but functional bow made from flexible wood, arrows tipped with sharpened stones. Most remarkably, there was evidence that Jacob had been preparing for winter, stockpiling dried meat and edible plants in quantities that suggested long-term planning. He wasn't just surviving, Eli said aloud, his voice filled with awe. He was thriving, he was adapting to life up here. But among all the survival gear and provisions, it was the smallest items that affected Eli most deeply. Wrapped carefully in a piece of waterproof material was a collection of objects that had no survival value, but enormous emotional significance. A smooth stone from their last camping trip together, a feather from a hawk they'd watched hunting near their campsite, a pressed flower that Jacob had picked during a family hike the previous spring.
Also,
These
maybe my
were
sister's
mementos
partner
of the
has
life Jacob
slightly
had left
smaller
behind,
hands.
treasures he'd carried
And
with him
so
into the wilderness
it will be fine
and
anyway
protected with
because
the
they've
same
hit them
care
anyway.
he'd given to essential survival gear. They spoke to the depth of his love for the family he was trying so hard to return to. As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the western peaks, Eli sat beside the cairn with Scout at his side, reading the landscape below with new understanding. From this vantage point, he could trace the route Jacob had taken through the wilderness, see the logic behind his son's choice of campsites, and the strategic thinking that had guided his survival efforts. Jacob had been trying to make his way home. Every camp, every cache, every carefully planned move had been part of a larger strategy to survive long enough to be found or to find his own way back to civilization. The cairn on this ridge had been both a signal beacon and a final declaration of love, a monument to a boy who'd refused to give up hope even when hope seemed impossible. He never stopped believing I'd find him. Eli said to Scout as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Even at the end, he was still fighting to get home to us.
That's very chunky.
Scout moved closer, close enough that Eli could feel the warmth of the dog's body against his leg. For the first time since they'd met, the animal seemed to be offering comfort rather than simply guidance. As if Scout understood that they'd reached the end of one journey and were about to begin another. In the growing darkness, the lights of the distant valley twinkled like stars, marking the boundary between the wilderness that had claimed his son and the civilization Jacob had died trying to reach. The discovery came by accident, the way most life-changing revelations do unexpectedly, and when Eli was focused on something entirely different. They'd spent the morning at Jacob's cairn, and Scout had been unusually restless, circling the memorial with an agitation that Eli couldn't understand. Finally, the dog had approached him directly and begun pawing at something around his neck. "What is it, boy?" Eli asked, kneeling down to get a closer look at what was troubling Scout. That's when he saw it, a collar, nearly invisible beneath Scout's thick coat, hidden by layers of fur that had grown over it during months or perhaps years of wilderness living. The collar was weathered leather, darkened by exposure to the elements, with a small metal tag that had been worn smooth, except for the faint outline of lettering. Eli's hands shook as he worked to free the tag from Scout's matted fur. The dog stood perfectly still during the process, as if he understood the significance of what was happening. When Eli finally managed to read the worn inscription, the words hit him like a physical blow. Sarah Chen, phone 555-0-847. If found, please call.
Yes, it does. So
Scout wasn't Jacob's dog. Scout wasn't wild. Scout belonged to someone named Sarah Chen, who was apparently missing, just as Jacob had been missing 15 years ago. The implications crashed over Eli in waves. If Scout wasn't wild, if he belonged to someone else, then how had he known where to find all the evidence of Jacob's survival? How had he navigated directly to sites that had taken search teams weeks to miss? How had he known about the compass, the journal, the cairn that Jacob had built in his final days? "Where is she?" Eli asked Scout, holding up the tag. "Where's Sarah?" Scout's response was immediate and unmistakable.
Small little guy.
The dog turned and began walking away from the cairn, moving with the same purposeful intensity that had characterized every expedition they'd taken together.
It is very
But
tiny.
this
I want to
time,
make a bigger one. That's
instead
like
of leading Eli toward
How big
evidence
is
of
Lotad?
Jacob's story, Scout was heading toward something entirely different. They descended from the ridge along a route Eli had never taken before, following game trails and natural corridors that required careful navigation through dense forest. Scout moved with the confidence of an animal that had traveled this path many times, and Eli found himself wondering how long the dog had been living in these mountains, how long his owner had been missing. After nearly 2 hours of hiking, Scout led him to a hidden valley that was invisible from any of the surrounding ridges. The valley was small, perhaps half a mile across, with a clear stream running through its center and natural meadows that would provide grazing for deer and elk. It was the kind of place that could
make a
sustain
life-size
someone indefinitely if they had the skills and determination to live off the land. Near the center of the valley, partially concealed by a grove of aspen trees, Eli could see the smoke from a small campfire. Scout quickened his pace, and his tail began wagging for the first time since Eli had known him. The dog was going home.
I'm doing good.
The woman who emerged from the trees to greet Scout was perhaps 40 years old, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and clothes that had clearly seen months of wilderness living. She was thin but not starved, weathered but not broken.
I can't remember.
When she saw Eli following behind Scout, her expression shifted from joy at the dog's return to wariness at encountering a stranger. You found him, she said, her voice rusty from disuse. I was starting to think he'd finally found his way back to civilization. Are you Sarah Chen? Eli asked, holding up the dog tag.
It's good to see you.
The woman nodded.
Hope you're doing well.
Sarah Chen, and you're the first person I've seen in 6 months who wasn't a hallucination. 6 months? Eli stared at her in disbelief. You've been living out here for 6 months? Sarah's laugh was bitter. Living might be too generous a word. Surviving, maybe. Existing. Scout's the one who's been doing the living. As they sat by Sarah's campfire, sharing coffee that tasted like the best thing Eli had consumed in years, Sarah told him her story. She'd come to Montana 6 months earlier, driven by grief that made Eli's own pain seem familiar. Her daughter Emma had been killed in a car accident caused by a drunk driver, and Sarah's marriage hadn't survived the aftermath. She'd lost her job, her house, and finally her will to continue living in a world that felt empty without Emma's laughter. I came up here to die, Sarah said matter-of-factly. Found a quiet place where I could just fade away without bothering anyone. But Scout had other ideas. The dog had found Sarah on her 3rd day in the wilderness, when hypothermia and dehydration had brought her close to the peaceful end she'd been seeking. Scout had refused to leave her alone, had forced her to stay warm, had led her to water and shelter when she was too weak to care for herself. He saved my life when I didn't want it saved. Sarah continued, kept bringing me things, food, dry wood for fires, even a sleeping bag he must have scavenged from somewhere. It was like having a wilderness guardian angel. But Scout's caretaking had gone beyond simple survival assistance. Over the months, the dog had led Sarah to places of beauty and peace that had gradually reawakened her appreciation for being alive. Sunrise viewpoints, where the world spread out below like a promise. Hidden meadows filled with wildflowers that seemed to exist purely for the joy of existing. Natural hot springs that made bathing in the wilderness feel like a luxury rather than a hardship. He brought me back to life, one day at a time, Sarah said, scratching Scout behind the ears. Not because he made the Teuton grief go away, but because he showed me that there's still beauty in the world worth experiencing even when your heart is broken. As Sarah spoke, Eli began to understand the true nature of Scout's gift. The dog hadn't just led him to evidence of Jacob's survival, he'd led him through a process of rediscovering his own connection to life. Each discovery, each revelation, had forced Eli to engage with the world in ways he'd been avoiding for 15 years. He does this, doesn't he?
I was thinking like maybe a few inches.
Finds people who are lost and helps them find their way back. Sarah nodded. I think Scout collects broken people, brings them to places that can heal them, shows them things that remind them why life matters. I don't know how he knows who needs help, but he's never wrong. The conversation continued into the evening. Two grieving parents sharing stories of loss and the long journey back towards something that resembled hope. Sarah had heard about Jacob's disappearance years ago. The story had become part of local legend, the tragedy of the ranger who'd lost his son and then lost himself. She'd been amazed when Scout began leading her to sites that contained evidence of a child's survival
It's a lot better than 7'4",
He brought
I can imagine.
To the cairn first, Sarah explained. I thought it was just a trail marker until I saw the initials. Then he started showing me other places, the camps,
And as
the
I say,
shelter,
I'm very
the
glad
journal.
that you were able to get it.
I realized I was seeing the story of a boy who'd refused to give
I didn't know
up.
it was a thing either,
Jacob's story helped you heal, Eli said, beginning to understand.
It's got to
Jacob's
feel so
courage
different
gave
for
me
you
courage,
walking around everyday
Sarah
life.
corrected. Reading about a 12-year-old who fought so hard to get home to his father made me ashamed of how easily I was giving up on my own life. If he could survive for weeks in these mountains, believing someone would find him, then maybe I could survive long enough to find reasons to keep going. As the stars emerged in the clear mountain sky, Eli sat by Sarah's fire, understanding that Scout's purpose went far beyond anything he'd imagined. The dog wasn't just leading people to Jacob's story, he was using Jacob's story to guide them toward healing. The boy's courage, preserved in compass and journal and stone cairn, had become a beacon for others who'd lost their way in grief. Scout lay between them by the fire, his work complete for now, his amber eyes reflecting the flames that had sustained Sarah through 6 months of wilderness solitude. Tomorrow, they would decide what came next. Tonight, it was enough to sit together under stars that Jacob had watched during his own journey, no longer alone with their grief. The next morning brought a clarity that surprised Eli with its intensity as he sat by Sarah's campfire, watching Scout move between the two of them with the contentment of a dog whose pack was finally complete.
That's for sure.
Eli realized that finding Sarah had transformed his understanding of everything that had happened over the past weeks. Scout hadn't been, leading him to closure about Jacob's death. The dog had been leading him toward a purpose that extended far beyond his own grief. Jacob's story, the courage, the determination, the refusal to surrender hope, even in impossible circumstances, had become something larger than a private family tragedy. It had become a source of healing for others who faced their own impossible circumstances. "There's something I need to show you," Eli told Sarah as they shared coffee and the simple breakfast she'd prepared from foraged plants and preserved meat. "Something Scout led me to that you haven't seen yet." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "I thought Scout had shown me everything. We've been to the journal site, the cairn, all the camps." "Not everything," Eli said, thinking about the final piece of Jacob's story that he'd discovered but hadn't yet fully processed. "There's one more place, the most important one." They broke camp together, Sarah moving with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to live with only essential possessions. Scout watched the preparations with obvious excitement, his tail wagging as he realized they were embarking on another expedition. But this time, instead of leading, Scout seemed content to walk beside them, allowing Eli to guide the way toward the discovery that would complete Jacob's legacy. The hike to Jacob's final resting place took most of the morning. Eli led them through familiar territory, now past the wagon where he'd found the compass, past the creek where Jacob's shirt fragment still fluttered from its branch, past all the sites that told the story of his son's remarkable survival. But he was seeing these places differently now, understanding them not just as evidence of Jacob's journey, but as waypoints on a path that could guide others through their own wilderness of grief. "He was extraordinary," Sarah said as they paused at the lean-to shelter Jacob had built. "The level of skill and determination for someone so young, it's almost impossible to believe." "Jacob was always special," Eli replied, running his hand along the precisely fitted branches that formed the shelter's frame. "But I don't think even he knew how special until he was tested in ways no child should ever be tested." As they approached the cave where Scout had first led him weeks ago, Eli felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with confronting the most painful aspects of Jacob's story. But now, with Sarah walking beside him and Scout moving confidently ahead, the pain felt different, less like an ending and more like a transformation. Inside the cave, Sarah examined Jacob's carefully preserved belongings with the reverence they deserved. She held the wooden whistle Eli had carved for his son, turning it over in her hands like an archaeologist studying an ancient artifact. "This is where Scout brings people, isn't it?" she asked quietly. "This is where the healing happens. Eli nodded. But there's more. One last thing that changes everything. From the deepest recess of the cave, where Scout had first guided him to look, Eli retrieved the item he'd found, but hadn't been emotionally ready to examine closely. Wrapped in oiled leather and hidden behind the cache of Jacob's possessions was a package that Scout had protected more carefully than anything else. Inside the leather wrapping was another piece of birch bark, but this one was different from the journal entries they'd found earlier. This was a single large piece, carefully prepared and inscribed with Jacob's most legible handwriting. It wasn't a journal entry, it was a letter. "Dad," the letter began, and Eli's voice caught as he read the words aloud for Sarah to hear.
Go out of your way to go to
If you're reading this, it means Scout found you and brought you to all the places I've been. I hope you're not mad at yourself anymore for what happened. I hope you know it wasn't your fault that I got lost.
You think I'm exaggerating?
Sarah moved closer as Eli continued reading, her own eyes filling with tears at the wisdom contained in a 12-year-old's final message to his father. I want you to know that I remembered everything you taught me. I used every survival skill, every lesson about reading weather and finding water and staying warm. I built fires the way you showed me, and I navigated by the stars like we practiced. You were a good teacher, Dad, and I was a good student. I survived because of you. The letter went on, describing Jacob's confidence that someone would eventually find his camps and understand the story they told. But the most remarkable passages dealt with Scout and the role Jacob envisioned for the dog after his own death. Scout is special, Dad. He's not just smart, he's wise in ways that seem almost human. I think maybe he was sent here to help people who get lost, not just in the wilderness but in life. I taught him to find all my camps, all the places where I left signs of being here. Someday, when someone needs to understand that it's possible to survive impossible things,
it's not your fault.
Scout
You didn't make these.
will show them what I did here. Sarah wiped her eyes as Eli's voice grew stronger, infused with pride at his son's extraordinary maturity. I want you to take care of Scout after I'm gone, but not the way you'd take care of a regular pet.
They're not my style.
Scout has work to do.
I'll say that.
There are going to be other people who need to see that someone can face terrible things and still choose hope. Promise me you'll help him do that work.
That's one hell of a
Promise
design.
me you'll let Jacob's story help other people the way Scout is going to help you. The final paragraph of Jacob's letter contained instructions that took Eli's breath away with their foresight and compassion. There's a place up on the high ridge where I built a cairn that you can see from all the valleys below. That's where I want to rest when my time comes. Not in some cemetery in town where people will feel sad when they visit. I want to be on the mountain, where people can come and feel strong instead of sad, where Scout can bring them when they need to remember that courage is always possible. As Eli finished reading, the cave fell into a silence that felt sacred. Sarah was crying openly, not from sadness, but from amazement at the depth of wisdom contained in Jacob's final gift to the world. Scout sat between them, his amber eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed to encompass everything Jacob had hoped he would become. He planned it all, Sarah whispered. Even at 12 years old, facing death alone in the wilderness, he was thinking about how his story could help others. I can imagine Doc wearing them. Eli folded the letter carefully, understanding for the first time the true scope of the responsibility Jacob had left him. His son hadn't just survived an extraordinary ordeal, he'd created a legacy that was meant to continue long after his death. Scout wasn't just a dog who'd happened to wander into Eli's life. He was Jacob's chosen messenger, carefully trained to guide others through the same journey of discovery that had just transformed Eli's understanding of grief and hope. We need to honor what he asked for, Eli said, his voice firm with newfound purpose. The cairn, the memorial, the work Scout is meant to do, all of it. Sarah nodded, but not just for Jacob. For Emma too. For everyone who needs to know that it's possible to face impossible things and still choose to keep fighting. As they prepared to leave the cave, Scout moved to a position near the entrance, looking out toward the high ridge where Jacob's cairn waited. The dog's posture conveyed both completion and anticipation, the satisfaction of a mission accomplished and the eagerness to begin the next phase of work that Jacob had envisioned. Tomorrow we go to the ridge, Eli said, feeling more certain about his path forward than he had in 15 years. Tomorrow we create the memorial Jacob wanted and begin the work he meant for us to do. Outside the cave, the afternoon sun painted the mountainside in shades of gold that reminded Eli of Jacob's hair when he was young. Scout led them toward the trail that would take them back to Sarah's camp, but his movement was different now. No longer the urgent pace of a guide leading people toward discovery, but the steady gait of a guardian accompanying his pack home. That night, as they sat around Sarah's campfire, planning the memorial ceremony that would honor both Jacob's courage and Emma's memory, Eli felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. He felt useful. He felt connected to a purpose larger than his own survival. Most importantly, he felt ready to step out of the wilderness of grief and back into a world where Jacob's legacy could continue to provide hope for others who found themselves lost in the darkness. Dawn broke clear and cold on the morning that would transform Jacob's lonely cairn into something far greater than a monument to one boy's courage. Eli woke before sunrise, his heart beating with a mixture of anticipation and nervous energy that reminded him of Jacob's excitement on Christmas mornings. Today wasn't about ending a journey, it was about beginning one that would honor his son's vision for how survival and hope could be shared with others who needed them most. Sarah was already awake, tending a small fire and preparing coffee with the methodical efficiency she'd developed during her months in the wilderness. Scout sat beside her, alert and focused in a way that suggested he understood the significance of what they were about to accomplish. The dog's amber eyes held an intensity that Eli had come to recognize as anticipation of meaningful work. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah asked, as Eli joined them by the fire. She'd been carrying the weight of Jacob's letter since he'd read it to her the day before, and her voice carried the reverence of someone who'd been entrusted with a sacred responsibility. "I've been ready for 15 years, Eli replied, surprised by the truth of his own words. "I just didn't know what I was getting ready for." They packed carefully for the expedition to the high ridge, carrying not just survival gear, but the symbolic items that would transform Jacob's cairn into a proper memorial. Eli had retrieved his old Forest Service badge from his cabin the evening before, cleaning years of tarnish from the metal until it gleamed like new. The badge represented his return to service, his willingness to guide others through wilderness, both literal and metaphorical. Sarah carried a small wooden cross she'd carved during her months of solitude, a symbol of her own journey back toward faith in something larger than grief. Scout seemed to understand that this wasn't a typical hiking expedition. He moved with ceremonial gravity, leading them along the now familiar trail toward the ridge, but pausing frequently to ensure they were together as a group. The climb to the ridge took longer than usual, not because of physical difficulty, but because each landmark they passed held new significance. The wagon, where Eli had found Jacob's compass, was no longer just evidence of his son's journey. It was the beginning of a path that had led multiple lost souls toward healing. The creek where Jacob's shirt fragment still fluttered in the breeze had become a way station, where grief could be acknowledged without becoming overwhelming. When they reached the ridge where Jacob's cairn stood silhouetted against the morning sky, Eli felt a presence that went beyond memory or imagination. His son's spirit seemed to inhabit this place, not as a ghost haunting the scene of tragedy, but as a living force that transformed stone and sky into something capable of healing broken hearts. "Look at this view," Sarah said softly, turning to take in the panoramic vista that stretched in every direction. "No wonder Jacob chose this spot. You can see everything from here, Every valley where people might get lost, every trail where someone might need guidance. Eli approached the cairn with the reverence due to holy ground. Jacob's carefully stacked stones had weathered 15 years of mountain weather, but remained sturdy and true. The initials carved into the top stone, JB and EB, caught the morning light like a message written in sunbeams. Working together, Eli and Sarah began the process of transforming the cairn from a private memorial into a public beacon of hope. They added stones they'd carried from Jacob's various campsites, each one representing a different aspect of his survival story. The compass stone from the wagon site, a piece of granite from the cave where he'd sheltered during storms, a smooth river rock from the creek where he'd found fresh water during his weeks alone. As they worked, Eli found himself telling Sarah stories about Jacob that he'd never shared with anyone, memories of camping trips, fishing expeditions, and quiet moments when his son had revealed the kind of wisdom that seemed far beyond his years. He always said that mountains were honest, Eli shared, as they fitted another stone into place, that they showed you exactly what you were made of without any pretending or sugarcoating. Sarah added her own stone to the growing memorial, a piece of quartz she'd found near her camp that caught light and threw rainbows across the surrounding rocks. "For Emma," she said simply. "So she's part of this too." When the expanded cairn was complete, Eli retrieved his Forest Service badge and pinned it to a wooden post they'd erected beside the memorial. The badge caught the wind and turned slowly, reflecting flashes of sunlight that could be seen from the valleys below. It was both a trail marker and a promise evidence that someone was watching over this place, ready to offer guidance to anyone who needed it. Scout approached the completed memorial and lay down beside it, assuming a position that spoke of permanent guardianship. The dog's placement seemed deliberate, as if he understood that his role had evolved from guide to sentinel. From this position, he could watch the approaches to the memorial and identify visitors who might need the kind of help that Jacob's story could provide. As the ceremony neared its completion, Eli felt a transformation occurring within himself that was as significant as any physical change to the memorial. The bitter hermit, who'd hidden from the world for 15 years, was giving way to someone who could offer guidance born from hard-won wisdom. Jacob's courage had become his own courage. His son's refusal to surrender hope had become his own commitment to helping others find reasons to keep fighting. The ceremony reached its crescendo when Eli pulled out the hand-carved wooden sign he'd worked on through the night by lantern light. The words burned into the pine board read simply, "Jacob's Rest, a place of peace." Below that, in smaller letters, "For all who seek hope in the wilderness." As he secured the sign to a sturdy post beside the memorial cairn, Eli felt 15 years of grief transforming into something he'd never expected, purpose that extended far beyond his own healing. The sign wasn't just marking Jacob's resting place. It was announcing the birth of a sanctuary where others could find the courage his son had demonstrated. "It's perfect," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "Jacob would be so proud." Scout rose from his position beside the cairn and approached the sign, sniffing it carefully as if memorizing its scent. Then, to Eli's amazement, the dog sat directly beneath the sign and looked out over the valleys below with an alertness that spoke of vigilant watching. The animal had assumed his official role as guardian of Jacob's Rest. The transformation of the site was complete, but as they stood together in the mountain silence, Eli realized that their real work was just beginning. Within hours of their return to the base of the mountain, word would spread about the memorial they'd created. People would come, some drawn by curiosity, others by desperate need for the kind of healing that Jacob's story could provide. "We need to be ready," Eli told Sarah as they prepared to leave the ridge. "There will be questions, and people who need more than just a memorial to visit. They'll need guidance." Sarah nodded, understanding immediately what he meant. Jacob's legacy wasn't just about preserving the memory of one remarkable boy, it was about creating an ongoing mission to help others navigate their own wildernesses of loss and despair. As they began their descent from the ridge, Scout took the lead with renewed purpose. But instead of the urgent guidance he'd provided during their weeks of discovery, his movement now carried the steady confidence of a working dog who knew exactly what his job entailed. He would bring the right people to Jacob's Rest at the right times, just as Jacob had trained him to do. Their first visitors arrived sooner than either Eli or Sarah had anticipated. As they reached the base of the ridge trail, they encountered a family that had clearly been hiking for hours. A middle-aged couple with a teenage boy who moved with the careful steps of someone recovering from serious injury. "Excuse me," the woman called out as they approached. "We're looking for something called Jacob's Rest. Someone in town said it was up this way." Eli exchanged a glance with Sarah, both of them recognizing the weight of grief the family carried in their posture and expressions. This was exactly the kind of encounter Jacob had envisioned when he'd planned Scout's mission. "You found it," Eli replied gently. "Or maybe it found you. I'm Eli Boone, and this is Sarah Chen. The memorial you're looking for is at the top of this ridge trail." The teenage boy looked up with interest that cut through his obvious physical discomfort. "Are you the ranger whose son built the survival camps? The one who survived for weeks on his own?" "Jacob was my son," Eli confirmed, feeling pride rather than pain as he spoke the words. "And yes, he built those camps. He left behind quite a story." The boy's parents introduced themselves as the Martinez family. Their son, Carlos, had been in a car accident 6 months earlier, the same accident that had killed his best friend. The physical injuries were healing, but the emotional trauma and survivor's guilt had left him withdrawn and hopeless. They'd driven 300 miles to visit Jacob's Rest after reading about it online, hoping that a story of survival against impossible odds might help their son find reasons to keep fighting. Scout approached Carlos with the gentle deliberation he'd shown when first approaching Eli weeks earlier. The dog seemed to recognize something in the boy that required special attention, and he positioned himself close enough to offer comfort without overwhelming someone who was clearly struggling with trust and connection. "Jacob was about your age when he faced his worst challenge," Eli told Carlos as they began the climb toward the memorial. "He had every reason to give up, but he chose to keep fighting. Not because fighting was easy, but because he believed there were people who needed him to survive." As they climbed, Eli found himself naturally falling into the role Jacob had envisioned for him, not preaching or lecturing, but simply sharing his son's story in ways that allowed others to find their own connections to hope and courage. Sarah walked beside the boy's mother, offering the kind of understanding that could only come from someone who'd faced similar darkness and found her way back to light. By the time they reached Jacob's Rest, the Martinez family had become more than visitors. They'd become the first participants in the ongoing mission that Jacob had designed. Carlos stood before the memorial cairn with tears in his eyes, not from sadness, but from recognition of strength he'd forgotten he possessed. Scout sat beside the boy as he read Jacob's story carved into stone and wood, the dog's presence offering silent testimony that survival was possible even when hope seemed impossible. The afternoon sun painted everything in golden light that made the entire ridge feel like sacred ground where healing could occur naturally, organically, one broken heart at a time. 1 year later, Eli stood on the same ridge where Jacob's memorial had transformed from a private monument into something far greater than he'd ever imagined possible. The simple cairn and wooden sign had grown into a proper sanctuary, with carefully maintained trails, basic shelter for overnight visitors, and a register where people could record their own stories of survival and hope. The changes went far beyond physical improvements. Jacob's Rest had become exactly what his son had envisioned, a place where people facing impossible circumstances could find evidence that courage was always possible, that survival was achievable even when hope seemed lost. Sarah emerged from the small cabin they'd built near the memorial site, carrying the morning coffee that had become their daily ritual. Over the past year, their partnership had evolved naturally from shared grief to shared purpose to something that felt like family. Not the desperate clinging of two broken people, but the steady companionship of two souls who'd found healing and chosen to dedicate their lives to helping others find the same peace. The Henderson family should be here within the hour, Sarah said, settling beside Eli on the bench they'd positioned to face the memorial. And the support group from Denver is planning to arrive this afternoon for their weekend retreat. Eli nodded, checking the schedule they maintained for visitors to Jacob's Rest. The memorial had become far more than a destination for individual pilgrims. It had evolved into a functioning wilderness therapy center where people could spend extended time learning the survival skills that had sustained Jacob during his weeks alone in the mountains. Scout appeared from his morning patrol of the surrounding trails, moving with the dignified purpose of an animal who'd fully grown into his calling. At 8 years old now, the German Shepherd had become a legend among the regular visitors to Jacob's Rest. Stories circulated about his uncanny ability to sense when someone was in emotional crisis, his talent for appearing at exactly the right moment to offer comfort, and his skill at guiding lost souls toward the specific aspects of Jacob's story that would resonate most powerfully with their particular struggles. "Look at him," Sarah said fondly, as Scout settled into his customary position beside the memorial cairn. "He still acts like he's personally responsible for every person who finds their way here." Watching the dog scan the horizon with eyes that seemed to see far beyond the visible landscape, Jacob trained him well. The morning brought their first visitor, a young woman named Jennifer, whose brother had died by suicide 6 months earlier. She'd driven through the night from Seattle, drawn by online testimonials from previous visitors who'd found hope at Jacob's Rest. Eli greeted her with the gentle authority he'd developed over the past year, understanding instinctively that she needed factual information about Jacob's survival before she could process the emotional implications of his story. As Eli guided Jennifer through the memorial site, explaining the significance of each artifact and survival technique Jacob had employed, Scout moved to walk beside the young woman with his characteristic intuition for matching his presence to someone's emotional needs. The dog didn't seek attention or petting, he simply provided the steady companionship that communicated acceptance and understanding without requiring words. By afternoon, the memorial site hosted nearly 20 visitors, representing a cross-section of human loss and resilience. The Denver support group included parents who'd lost children, veterans struggling with survivor's guilt, and individuals facing terminal diagnoses who needed to find meaning in their remaining time. Mixed among them were families like the Martinez group, returning for their third visit because Carlos had found such strength in Jacob's example that he'd decided to pursue wilderness therapy as a career. The evening ceremony had become the cornerstone of every group visit to Jacob's Rest. As the sun began setting behind the western peaks, painting the memorial in the same golden light that had illuminated Jacob's final weeks in the mountains, Eli stood before the gathered visitors and began the ritual that had evolved naturally over dozens of previous gatherings. Jacob's final letter asked us to remember that courage is always possible, Eli began, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. He wanted his story to remind others that survival isn't about avoiding difficult circumstances, it's about finding ways to keep moving forward, even when the path seems impossible to navigate. One by one, visitors shared their own stories of loss and the specific aspects of Jacob's journey that had provided them with renewed determination. Jennifer spoke about her brother's creativity and how learning about Jacob's ingenious survival techniques had reminded her to honor her brother's innovative spirit rather than focusing solely on his final despair. A veteran named Michael described how Jacob's careful preparation and strategic thinking had inspired him to approach his own PTSD recovery with the same methodical determination the boy had brought to wilderness survival. An elderly woman named Ruth, facing advanced cancer, had found peace in Jacob's acceptance of circumstances beyond his control while maintaining fierce dedication to the things he could influence. As the formal ceremony concluded, and individual conversations continued around small fires scattered across the memorial site, Eli found himself experiencing the deep satisfaction that comes from work that aligns perfectly with purpose. He'd spent 15 years running from his role as a guide and protector, but Jacob's legacy had called him back to service in ways that honored both his professional skills and his personal understanding of loss. Scout moved among the visitors with his usual grace, somehow knowing exactly who needed a gentle nudge toward conversation and who required the comfort of silent companionship. The dog's presence had become as integral to the healing process at Jacob's Rest as the memorial itself, living proof that connection and loyalty could transcend even the most challenging circumstances. As the stars emerged in the clear mountain sky, Eli sat beside Sarah on their bench, overlooking the memorial, watching the last visitors settle into their sleeping bags around carefully tended fires. The scene reminded him powerfully of family camping trips with Jacob, when the boy would insist on staying awake as long as possible to count shooting stars and share observations about the vast universe stretching overhead. He would be amazed by this. Sarah said softly, echoing Eli's own thoughts. "He planned it," Eli replied, feeling certain of Jacob's continued presence in everything they'd accomplished. Every detail, from Scout's training to the location of the memorial to the kind of people who'd be drawn here. Jacob understood something about healing that took me 15 years to learn. Scout raised his head at the mention of Jacob's name, amber eyes reflecting starlight, as he looked toward the memorial cairn, where his young trainer's legacy continued to provide hope for broken souls, finding their way back to wholeness. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new stories, new opportunities for Jacob's courage to kindle courage in others. The wilderness that had once seemed like an ending had become the setting for countless new beginnings, and Scout kept faithful watch over all of them.